Hi, so let's get right to it. I think we need a better way for you to bring technology that's new and emerging to your firm in a way that creates more business value. So, in the next 30 minutes, that's exactly what we're going to talk about with some new research that no one has ever seen all put together before that will give you the ability to help your firm become part of the leading edge. So, we're going to cover a lot of ground in 30 minutes. So, to do that, I've created a roadmap that I'm going to refer to from time to time in the presentation that'll kind of help you follow along. So the first thing we're going to talk about is some survey data about what leading edge firms do that's different. And we'll talk about what everybody else does and perhaps why there's some problems with it. And then what I'll do once we kind of understand the problems is I'll give you a solution in terms of a new thought pattern to apply to how you approach emerging technology. And then I'll bring that pattern to life with two examples, real world firms doing things. And then the last thing I'll do is I'll give you some ideas about how to go take additional research and tools that are available to you on our website so that you can start applying that creative energy that you've heard Jay and Ted talk about already to all the information and things that you'll get from this presentation, and you can start taking action immediately. So let's get started. So the first thing you need to understand that you really have to get is that according to the Future Fit survey of 530 innovation executives that we just conducted, firms that approach emerging technology differently tend to be high growth. So let's look at some of the data and why we think that. So first off, we ask in our survey of 530 executives how their firm generally approached emerging technology. And we asked them using Geoffrey Moore's model from Crossing the Chasm. So if you remember that model, we asked them to classify how their firm approaches new technologies by asking if they were laggards, early majority, late majority, early adopters, or innovators. And if you remember from the book, innovators were firms that said they were willing to develop technology that didn't exist in the market if they felt it gave them a competitive advantage. So the next thing we did is we took all the respondents in the survey and we created three classes based on how they answered questions and self-reported growth in the industry they were in. And we classified those segments as contenders. Contenders had average to low growth and implemented few, if any, of our innovation best practices. The next segment is higher growth performers or high performers. And high performers, a little bit higher growth and implementing more of our best practices. The final segment was what we called leading edge. And leading edge companies were the highest growth and were implementing most, if not all, of our innovation best practices. So once we understood the segments of the data, then we were able to compare the segments of the data to how their firm approached emerging technology, and the results were really interesting. We found that the average to low growth contenders, as you might expect, gave us pretty much a normal distribution curve of how they approach emerging technology. That's kind of what we figured would happen. When you look at the higher growth, the next high performer segment, what we found is that segment was shifted to the right. More tendency to be early adopters or even innovators. But when we look at the highest growth, the leading edge segment, what we saw is that segment was almost entirely shifted to the right. Most of them are innovators or at least early adopters. And what you need to understand is this high growth leading edge segment was growing 300% faster than competitors in their industry. Wouldn't you like to be one of those? What this emphasizes here is the critical importance of understanding how to approach emerging technology the right way. So you have to get this right. So how do most firms do it? That's what I'm going to look at next. One of the issues you're going to run into, but it'll be the hardest issue for you as a technology leader, is frankly the sheer number of technologies that you have to keep track of, right? For example, when I first started in this role at Forrester a decade ago, we published a top 15 or top 10 emerging technologies type report, and that was enough then. Well, today, we track over 370 individual technologies, and 70 of those technologies we consider emerging. So the question is, how do you keep track? How do you select the right ones and make them ready? And more importantly, how do you map those so that you know you're getting business value? Well, let me show you how most firms do it. This, many of you will recognize, is a tech radar. For those of you who haven't, I'll explain it. The little figures are little icons you see, the circles and the triangles, those are technologies, and they get plotted in a ring of concentric circles where the innermost circle says these are technologies that you should be implementing, that you've adopted or are adopting. The next ring out are technologies that you're trialing, that are almost ready, or maybe you're implementing them in a limited capacity. The next ring out is ones that you are looking at, you are assessing, you are thinking about. And the outermost ring are on hold. Those are those technologies that are kind of watching, but that's a thing you're going to do later. Now, the problem with this approach is that firms who employ this tend to implement and make ready a bunch of technologies, but they don't have a clear idea about how those technologies deliver business value, and they don't know how those technologies work together, because in many cases, all these technologies are building on one another and integrated, but they don't have any view into that. And that's a problem, right? And let me give you an example. Blockchain is the perfect example. So in a trend report that my colleague Martha Bennett wrote called Blockchain Fades into the Background, where it belongs and can deliver, Martha identifies the trend around blockchain that she sees happening. And initially, she says, like I said, blockchain is the poster child for technologies where the expectations were high and firms got into implementing or trying to implement blockchain before their business, their market, their business partners, and their customers were ready. And they ran into problems where those ideas were dashed on the rocks of reality. But what she sees happening now is the fact that today blockchain is finding its place in the enterprise infrastructure, right? As firms realize what it takes to be successful with blockchain. But she says about the future that the real future of blockchain is this whole concept of blockchain inside, where more and more other technologies incorporate blockchain as that critical trust infrastructure that enables automation of these trust-based business relationships, right? But that's going to take maybe 5 or 10 more years to play out. The next thing she talks about in the trend that I want to focus on for a sec is all the technologies involved. You see, it's not just like distributed ledgers technology or things like zero knowledge proofs, but she lists a number of technologies: IoT, location intelligence, artificial intelligence, that tend to show up adjacent to or alongside blockchain and innovation initiatives, right? And what I want you to realize is that if we just took these technologies themselves and put them on a tech radar and implemented individual ones, or said, what are the risks of these things and when do we want to implement them, we won't see the value. And so what I'm here to tell you is that in order to deliver that value, which is what your business expects of you today, what you're being called to do, to deliver that value, you have to go beyond, you have to do more. You need a better way to approach emerging technology. Which brings me to the next section of our presentation, where we actually talk about what that solution is. So this is important. If you remember nothing else about our 30 minutes here, remember this pattern in this slide. I think you need to move away from thinking about adopting individual emerging technologies, like the ones we just talked about in the blockchain trend, right? Because many of these technologies are accessible to you today through things like the cloud in a way that were much easier before. And there's so many more technologies that instead of thinking about individual technologies and making them ready, what you need to do is you need to start developing opportunities that you identify by studying trends. So think about this is the pattern. We're going to use this pattern over and over for the rest of this presentation. You have trends. Trends highlight opportunities. Opportunities involve many technologies. So when we think about the many technologies, we're not only talking about emerging technologies, we're talking about a spectrum of technologies that exist between mature and emerging. And that assessment of a technology along that spectrum is simply your assessment of what a technology's maturity risk is. But recognize, and this is important, when you think about an opportunity, there are many more risks that you have to consider. For example, business risks. Is your business ready? Do you have the culture? Customer risks. Are your customers ready for this? Regulatory and other market risks that you have to think about. So when we start thinking about opportunities to apply multiple emerging technologies, we recognize that these opportunities exist on a horizon. They may be short-term, in other words, you're ready to go after them now. They may take a few years and be midterm, or they may be longer-term opportunities. The thing to understand and what this approach is going to do for you is it's going to give you a view into all the risks and the benefits of an opportunity so that you can pursue some of those longer term ones, because the longer term ones, our data shows, have much bigger return on investment, but they're also much more difficult because of the risk involved. So that's the idea. Now, the question you're asking me is, okay, that sounds kind of academic, Brian. How do you actually go do it? And that's where I want to spend most of the time I have here. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at two examples that actually bring this idea to life. And just remember, before I do, the pattern. We're going to look at trends, then we're going to look at opportunities, and then we're going to talk about the many technologies it takes to realize the value in those opportunities. So example one, the trend I want to talk about is AI is becoming collaborative and customizable. Again, it's another report that my colleague, Michelle Getz, and I co-authored about the future of AI. And what we're actually saying in that trend is that AI is moving from being about individual teams of data scientists, maybe working in an enterprise, to being a lot more network, collaborative, working together. And that movement is going to have some profound impacts on the way AI models are developed over time, making AI models more accessible and maybe even more customizable. Someday, Michelle thinks maybe even like macros in a spreadsheet. But that's pretty far down the road, so I don't want to focus on that. What I want to focus on in the example is the fact that a lot of these new AI technologies, like federated machine learning, are going to be implemented or by new partners and new platforms and give rise to new relationships and new business models. But before I do that, so let's just drill into that technology just a little bit and look at the way that AI models are built today. The way AI models are built today is shown you right here. These advanced models, specifically ones for image recognition, computer vision, these deep learning models are typically built by teams where the data is centralized in a kind of a big data lake. And then the model is trained off of that centralized data. And you have to get that data from somewhere. And unless you're Amazon or Google, it means you have to, in a lot of cases, get that from a partner. And that can be hard. Well, the trend we're seeing is around new platforms that implement a thing called federated machine learning. And federated machine learning allows AI models on a common platform to, instead of sharing data, to share something called parameters. And those parameters allow models to learn from each other without sharing the data, which lowers risk and accelerates the time to value, right? So kind of once you understand that, now it's like many of you probably have some opportunities that kind of already understand this, bouncing around in your head, some creative ideas. But let's connect the dots just a little bit by actually talking about the German Institute for Neurodegenerative Diseases. And I had to practice that a lot. That's a mouthful. But what DZ&E does is they study brain diseases and look for new ways to diagnose and treat them. And I had a fascinating conversation with Dr. Joachim Schultz, who's the director of systems medicine at DZ&E. And he, like many of his colleagues, believe that the future of diagnostic medicine is using these new advanced AI models to diagnose diseases like brain disease much, much earlier and therefore get ahead of them in treatment. Now, their dream for years was to be able to collect all this data in that big data lake and build these models. But as you can imagine, and talking to Dr. Schultz, that was a problem, right? Very hard. So to kind of test this idea out and to prove they can even do it, they collected 12 or 10 years, 12,000 samples of blood test data of people who had leukemia. And once they collected all that data in a centralized model, they were able to build an advanced machine learning model that could detect the leukemia much, much earlier than classic testing. So they proved it worked. But in Dr. Schultz's words, took forever, right? They had to negotiate collecting all that data from all the universities and research hospitals that are kind of in their loose federation or loose network. So the opportunity they wanted to pursue is maybe we could work in a new platform and do it a little bit differently, right? And so the opportunity they pursued is with a partner, HPE Research, their Swarm AI platform, which implements federated machine learning, but it has blockchain inside. Remember that trend we talked about? And what the blockchain inside does is it enables DZ&E's partners who also have data to come onto the platform, build their models, and let those models begin to share parameters. But the mechanics of trust to bring the platform, establish the models, share the models, add the data is all handled by a blockchain smart contract, right? And so what they did when they did this is they went back to that leukemia blood test experiment they did, and they built it this way, using this kind of a platform without sharing data, just sharing model parameters. And what they found is that that model worked just as well as the centralized one. So they were excited by this, and they started to look at other models, including X-ray data for detecting tumors in soft tissue. And they found that, again, that federated model worked just as well. And so they got really excited about this, and now they're pursuing other tests. But what's really interesting about what Dr. Schultz is doing and what he's seeing is the network that's forming, because they're already working with other government organizations, other universities and hospitals, but private hospitals, in Dr. Schultz's words, have a pile of data and they have no incentive to share it because it's risky and it's regulated. And so what they're able to do with blockchain is define the trust mechanics and the relationships so that private hospitals who are sitting on a pile of data can be guaranteed some benefit as these diagnostic tests come to market downstream. And it's incentivizing them to participate in a new AI collaboration network and a new set of business models that are growing around this. So it's a perfect example of pursuing an opportunity from understanding this trend that we're talking about. Now, the next thing I want to talk about just very briefly is all the technologies that you need to make this happen. Certainly data management and cloud, but those aren't all that new. Blockchain, federated machine learning is really new. So the idea here is if you were just looking at each of these technologies individually on your tech radar, you wouldn't see this opportunity, right? So clearly we need a better way to do this. And the way to do this is by first looking at the opportunities that come when you see the trend and then packaging that opportunity along with many technologies and the risks associated with them and pursuing that idea. So let's look at a second example before I end. The second example, the trend I want to talk to you about here is another one that I wrote with my colleague Michelle Polino about edge computing. It's called Workload Affinity Becomes the Strategy for Edge Computing. So for those of you who, the term edge computing has been around for a while now, most of you have heard it. For those of you who are not sure exactly what it is, very simply, edge computing is the distribution of software for like IoT systems out to the edge of networks, but connecting that software back to core systems running in your data center or cloud. That's really all it is. Let's look at that a little bit. So the average IoT type of edge architecture looks something like this. You're going to have some workloads running maybe on some cameras, processing video imagery, doing some image recognition. Maybe you're doing a smart parking type application. So you're going to have some code running in some servers, maybe at a shopping mall. And then if you're doing this at multiple shopping malls, you're going to want to centralize it all. So you're going to have some of that system running in your data center or cloud. The deal with this is that once you make a decision in a traditional architecture about where your code runs, it stays there. And it's very hard to change. And so the trend that Michelle and I wrote identifies this concept of workload affinity as being the future of edge computing. And what workload affinity means is that those software components can start to move, maybe in an automated way. So for example, maybe you need to pull some copies of some code running on your cameras that have learned something about what those cameras are seeing. And you need to pull those back to a central server and let a bunch of the different copies of code train each other, right? Like we learned, federated machine learning, and then redeploy that code out to different cameras, maybe cameras that have never seen that code before. So they can be smart as well. So the ability to pull code from one place, move it to another, and do so in an automated way is actually what we call edge or workload affinity. So when we think about workload affinity, that again kind of sounds perhaps a little bit abstract. And so let's actually look at a company that's doing something with edge computing in this concept. And before I actually look at that company though, I want to just spend a second and talk about why you would even want to do this, right? So there are some technical benefits for implementing edge computing in this way, specifically things like higher performance applications, processing more structured and unstructured data, lower application and networking costs. But the real reason why you'd want to do this, and the reason that this company that we're going to talk about is doing it, is it allows you to build new kinds of applications that have never been built before. That's the business reason here. So let's look at what one of those applications might be, and let's look at Qualcomm. So again, I had a conversation with Sanjeet Pandit, who's the director of smart cities and enterprise digital transformation for Qualcomm. And his business unit, which has been around about 3.5 years, it's a new business unit that he founded, is, in his words, designed to be a one-stop shop for everything their customers need to implement IoT and digital transformation type services. And as you can imagine, this has been a high growth. Now they have dozens of customers all over the world. And they also have a startup accelerator. And that startup accelerator is important because that's where they found this startup, Juganu. And what Juganu does is they make an IoT computing platform with an edge computing component where you can deploy software into smart LED light bulbs. Now, to understand why that's really cool and why that's workload affinity, you have to understand what a smart LED light bulb is. And so I'm showing you here on the screen some of the things that go into the light bulbs they make. Now, Qualcomm saw an opportunity, and the opportunity they're pursuing is this. They had a customer in South America who wanted to bring internet from an internet-rich part of the city to an internet desert. And they were looking at doing a 6-month cable project, digging the cable underground. It's going to take a long time and it'd be very expensive. And so what Qualcomm, understanding what Juganu could do and seeing this startup in their startup accelerator, said, what if we do it differently? What if instead of digging that cable, we simply begin changing the light bulbs in the street lights in the city, right? So that once we've installed those light bulbs, we use the Juganu platform to deploy into those light bulbs the Wi-Fi software we need to bring internet through the light bulbs in a mesh to a different part of the city. And they successfully did that, and they were able to accomplish in a number of days what would have otherwise taken them 6 months to do. Now that was pretty cool, but what was really cool about what Qualcomm saw is they began to ask themselves, well, if I can do that for Wi-Fi, what other kind of software could I use, and what would that mean? So part of their business is digital transformation, and they're working with a lot of retailers as they do that digital transformation, and they ask themselves, what if instead of Wi-Fi software, we could deploy into the light bulbs a distributed point of sale software system and integrate that with sensors on shelves and Apple Pay and Visa Pay, so that when customers walked into a shopping mall or a big box store, picked something up off the shelf, the payment was handled behind the scenes as the customer is leaving, reducing the need for the cashiers. What if we could do that? And as a matter of fact, that's experiments they're doing right now, and that's exactly what they're doing. So you notice here, I didn't give you a AI image processing kind of machine learning thing. I talked about how practically they're using this technology to deliver different packages of software out to this edge computing / IoT type platform. And that is the early stages of what we call workload affinity. And here's some real life examples of how firms are pursuing it. So just like we talked about before, realize that pursuing this opportunity was not just an individual set of technologies like IoT, networking, software-defined networking, mesh networking, cloud. There's some AI mixed in there as well. And if you just were looking at these individual technologies on your tech radar and not worrying about how they work together, which ones came first and second, what the risk of all of these together were, you wouldn't be able to pursue opportunities like Qualcomm's pursuing or like you saw DZ&E pursue. So just to wrap this section up, to repeat, there's a pattern here, right? We talked about trends, and trends provide clues about the future that lead to opportunities. And those opportunities often bring many technologies and the risks associated with those technologies to a business need or a business idea, and they themselves together have a horizon and they have a benefit. And once you kind of understand that, then you can begin to kind of wrap that information into a package. And I'm going to show you how to do that in just a few minutes. You can wrap that information into a package that can get some real innovation traction at your firm. And you won't see this just using a tech radar and saying, oh, look, IoT is ready. Look, edge is ready. Look, machine learning is ready. That won't deliver. And that's what you need to do. So that kind of concludes a big piece of the presentation here where we've brought to life some of these ideas. How do you use this new pattern with some real examples? And what it should have done is given you a lot of creative energy. You should be thinking about how to apply some of these technologies like these companies have done, but to your firm. So what I want to do now as we wind this presentation down is I want to bring to you some research tools, things that you can go to our website now, download and read to get even more ideas that will help you take technology and create value at your firm. So the first of those research tools is a report that you see on the screen here. It's called the Top Trends and Technologies to Watch Q3 2021. You can download it. And that report has a number of the trends that we talked about today, but I wrap those trends together in a narrative that will help you understand even some bigger ideas and some bigger directions that we see. So I'm going to take a moment and kind of talk about that and explain how some of these pieces work together. So certainly we talked about a lot of opportunities. I gave you 2 examples. Well, the first thing you'll see when you read this report and a number of trends point at, we see a number of trends pointing at the idea that these innovations are often delivered by new platforms, and either you work with new partners or new partnerships are created because of these platforms. So new partnerships and new platforms is a big piece of enabling these opportunities like the ones you saw. So the AI collaboration networks trend that we went over is a perfect example of that, but we have others when you read the report. The second 2 trends we talked about, blockchain and edge computing, the way to think about those, and when you read the report, we think about those in terms of emerging technology scaffolding. And these often work together, like AI and blockchain or IoT and edge. And these things work together in a way that creates a place for new partnerships and new platforms to arise that enable those innovations. So we have a whole bunch of more trends around that you'll read in the report. And the last set of trends, which you don't have time to cover, unfortunately, are around your need for a foundation upon which to erect that scaffolding of emerging technology that is both resilient and secure. And so we have trends around resilience, security, privacy, and the like in the report. And you can think of those as the foundation you need to use emerging technology effectively and securely with appropriate risk so that you can leverage new platforms and build new partnerships to deliver these innovations. So when you read this report, that's the way you think about that tool. I want to give you one more tool before we run out of time here. And that tool is, again, in a report called Master Emerging Technology Research. And in that tool, I give you a recipe, which is an acronym for RECPI, for how you do this thing that we've shown you on a consistent basis, and how you make it into a process that you're constantly doing. And in that recipe, we provide you recommendations, and there's other research reports beyond this one that you can access that tell you how to do that research, not only research individual emerging technologies, which you might still drop on a tech radar, but then also how to define and identify opportunities as these technologies come together, and then communicate those opportunities to a set of candidate stakeholders to identify potential sponsors. Those are business executives with funds to spend, right? And those are the folks that are going to have a lot of questions about risk and readiness. It's going to require you then to go into the P part of our model called prove. And in prove work, not only are you proving out the maturity of the technology's readiness for you, but you're also proving out your readiness for the technology. And you're looking at all those risks holistically and answering candidate, stakeholder, and sponsor questions and communicating those answers. Then as you iterate through that, the last piece that's differentiating in our framework is that we recognize that there's different kinds of innovation going on at every firm. There is ad hoc innovation, strategic innovation, and disruptive innovation. And each one of these kinds of innovation have different characteristics, different things that you need to understand to approach your business with. And so we recognize these different kinds of innovation in the framework, and we provide guidance for you that tells you how to do that research and how to structure your opportunities so that you can integrate the information you've built into these different kinds of innovation, which is where you apply more resources and funding to actually go pursue opportunities more quickly. The last thing we do in the framework is we recognize that this is not just a static set of things you do once, but rather a set of processes that you do over and over, right? And that brings us to the end of our time, right? So just to remember, we've talked about the importance of emerging technology and how leaders do it that everybody else doesn't. And I've given you a solution, which is a pattern to identify opportunities from trends that bring together these ideas and these technologies into a package that has a horizon and risk and benefits. And then the last thing we've done is we've actually given you some research tools so you can take all this creative energy that you're going to develop at this forum from all the ideas that you've had, and you can go back to your desk and you can start going and doing and delivering value from emerging technology now. So thank you very much. My name is Brian Hopkins. I'm sorry we couldn't be together in person this year. I was really looking forward to giving this on stage, maybe next year. Until then, I look forward to talking to each of you. Thank you.
That's some really powerful analysis from Brian with some great real-world examples of applied creativity. We have one more keynote for you today where Kate Legg